Just on the anti-war and anti-occupation movement, and I'm talking about the anti-war, anti-occupation movement in this country in its broadest possible form, in its most, with all its components, in its most diverse form. I am not focusing on any particular organisation within it. But broadly, 6 years ago, 2002, 2003, we knew what to do to mobilise public opinion. We did the marches, we did the demonstrations, there was some small-scale industrial action, there could have been more. There were some wonderful things, such as the school students walking out in protest on the day of the invasion. There was pressure on MPs. We broadly got the tactics right. It didn't work, we didn't stop the war, but we certainly mobilised public opinion, and the world knew that a significant proportion of the British public, probably a majority of the British public, were against invading Iraq. It didn't make a difference to Blair, lined up with the Tories and Labour MPs who voted through the invasion, as Mike said at the beginning of this session. That act, that vote in favour of the invasion, distanced the political class from the general population, and they were able to get away with it. So, broadly, we got the message right 6 years ago. It didn't work. A shrug, no, we didn't. It was important to do what we did, but we didn't succeed. It's also true that once there had been an invasion, then for many people who were opposed to the invasion in the first place, the focus of what to do next was unclear, partly because the marches and the demonstrations hadn't worked. In the US, the anti-war movement in 2004 threw itself into the US presidential election under Hyman Kerry, and there are certainly a number of American anti-war activists who would say that whilst it was terribly important to try and defeat George Bush, then to a certain extent the anti-war movement lost its focus as a result of doing that. I think here one of our biggest problems came with the 2005 general election, which was really something of a watershed. And if you think about it, it's quite extraordinary that a Serbian Prime Minister, who the public broadly knows lied in order to bring the country into an illegal and immoral war, simply at the behest of the US and George Bush. It is quite extraordinary that he could have remained leader of his party, fought a general election, and indeed won a general election. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. The Tories were in disarray. The Tories were not exactly a focus for anti-war protest themselves because they'd supported the war. Insofar as there was a focus for anti-war protest, it was principally around the Liberal Democrats, because I'm going to ignore a number of the smaller parties for the moment. It was principally around the Liberal Democrats, and they were never going to stand up. They're not a national challenge to Labour. And, of course, within the Labour Party, where traditionally there would have been focus for anti-war and anti-occupation activism, then it's very hard for the left in the Labour Party, such as remains in the Labour Party, to be able to make that case. We know that from the fact that John McDonnell wasn't able to stand against Gordon Brown a year ago. So 2005, I think, was something of a dreadful watershed for us, because it allowed Blair and New Labour to say, in those terrible words, well, we have put Iraq behind us. We have put the issue of the war, of the decision to go to war behind us. And because there was really no electoral focus against war in 2005, then that response from Blair had some resonance. The other problem that we've faced over the last 6 years is a response to the well-intentioned question, often by people who did impose the invasion, and again both Sammy and Mike have referred to this, of, well, the British troops are there is a level of sectarian violence and criminality, some of it fostered by the occupation, but it's there and it's dreadful, and therefore the troops have to be there in order to make things better for the lives of Iraqi people. Now, Sammy, Haifa, other speakers answer that question eloquently with a list of the occupation's crimes and how those crimes are never going to be resolved until there has been withdrawal. But sadly, Sami and Haifa's voices, other voices like that, are not frequently heard on the media, and that became a well-intentioned liberal question where the answers were not generally heard in the mainstream. The other point we faced, and I think now the argument has been blown out of the water, but was a slightly nostalgic view that the British troops had been more responsible than the American troops, and that they knew how to police Basra because they'd policed Northern Ireland so well. And there was a certain amount of smugness when the scandals at Abu Ghraib came out, but that smugness has really been overcome now by the deaths of Baha Musa, the evidence of torture and indeed executions of Iraqis detained by British troops in is it Operation Breadbasket?
In Maysan province.
Yeah.
About 20 Iraqis.
20 Iraqis executed by British troops. There have been a number of legal cases about that. I don't think anybody seriously believes these days that British troops are more responsible than American troops. But these were all a number of problems that the anti-war movement and anti-occupation movement had to face, and we didn't face terribly well, and I'm not suggesting that there were any easy answers to any of those. I'm not suggesting that there is a way, but I am suggesting that we run into the ground slightly. And this statement is something to try and help rebuild the anti-war and anti-occupation movement, because for the first time it talks about positive action, that the British people, citizens of a country that is illegally occupying Iraq, can actually do to stand shoulder to shoulder with Iraqis. We're no longer talking about the negatives. The negatives are important. Bring the troops home now is withdraw now is extremely important. But this statement is also about looking at what can be done positively, but positively with a very clear awareness that it is for Iraqis to determine their own fate, and our responsibilities as citizens of a country that has been illegally occupying Iraq is to provide solidarity for what Iraqis need to do to rebuild their country. Sami has talked far more eloquently than I could do about the divisions in the political class and how those divisions aren't quite as clear as indeed the political class would like us to think that they are. There is a general consensus between the political within the political class that Iraq should be a satellite state of US-UK influence. And so Sami had says the real difference is whether there should be permanent military presence for the Bush-McCain Republicans want, or some sort of low-level military presence but what there is consensus over is political influence and economic influence over Iraq. And we've seen that by the fact that nobody in the political class, with the exception in Britain of the usual suspects of the handful of left Labour MPs, with the exception in the States of Dennis Kucinich, will talk about the handing over of Iraq's economic resources and principally Iraq's oil resources to multinational corporations. That law has gone through with very little publicity in these two countries, despite the valiant efforts by activists, and it's part of the consolidation of Iraq as a satellite state of Britain and America. Obviously, if Obama were elected in November, in many ways that would be a great victory, because it would be the American public saying, rejecting Bush, McCain and the neoconservative view of the world. But for Iraqis, one has to wonder how much is going to change. There's going to be a degree of withdrawal anyway, because as speakers have said, that's now become commonplace, and military presence is going to be replaced by political and economic influence.